have the honor to be the last speaker. I will be relatively short so that we can really spend more time talking as a group and hopefully answering some of the questions. But again, thank you all so much for participating today. I'm going to discuss with you the role of multidisciplinary care and what we're building at MD Anderson as a brain metastases clinic and research program, and it's the Andrew M. McDougall Brain Metastases Clinic and Research Program. So I'm just going to, briefly summarize some of what you've heard today. Obviously, managing brain metastases is a multidisciplinary approach by definition. You've heard from Dr. Ferguson how important it is to use surgery where it could be incredibly helpful in solitary or a few brain metastases. You heard how quickly it can actually palliate symptoms and improve, the quality of life of patients with brain metastases. You've also heard from Dr. Swanson how important radiation is, and again, it's been a mainstay of therapy for our patients. It is very effective for small tumors, and we think about whole brain potentially that's what WBXRT stands for, whole brain radiation therapy. We think about it as a palliative approach in patients with multiple brain metastases or leptomeningeal disease. But I think you also heard that one of the main issues with any local intervention is that doesn't necessarily help other cancers other tumors that are in the brain itself when you don't address them directly, and doesn't help tumors that are outside the brain. One of the other challenges we face is that multidisciplinary care means multiple clinics that people will have to go through. The radiation oncologist, if you've been at MD Anderson, at some point you will know that it's many buildings and walking between them is not easy. The radiation oncologists are in one location, the neurosurgeons in others, and the medical oncologists, like our breast medical oncology, are in a different building altogether. And again, coordinating care and seeing patients on multiple days of the week and sometimes weeks may be really difficult. What you also heard today is that patients with brain metastases have been excluded from clinical trials traditionally, and unfortunately continues to be the case. And one of the reasons, or some of the reasons cited here, this is not stuff I believe in, but this is what people talk about, is that, those patients have a worse prognosis, they can deteriorate relatively quickly, so we have to be careful with, they may not be able to get benefit from being on a clinical trial. You've also heard about how drugs may or may not penetrate the blood-brain barrier, and how the immune system is not it cannot actually get into the brain, or the brain has been used or mentioned as an immune sanctuary. And those are not unreasonable. If you look at some of the kind of unique aspects of the brain, I think one thing you've heard a lot from all of our speakers is how well protected it is. And if you think about some of the protective structures, so first of all, you have the bony structures that are incredibly tight and very, designed to absolutely prevent the brain from getting a trauma as much as possible, and even the spinal cord. We also know that with the bone as our first line of defense, we also have under the bone and before you get to the brain, these layers that are called the leptomeninges that you've heard about. And again, these layers are, the first one is called the dura mater, and it's literally is so hard. That's what the word comes from. It's one of the toughest fibrous structures in the body. So really effective at also preventing direct trauma to the brain. And then, the other layers, including the pia mater, just goes right above the brain matter. And then at a microscopic level, when you look at what's called the blood-brain barrier, it's not just a physical barrier. So there are several variations to it. So you see in this figure, the blood is in the middle, and you see these lining of the blood vessels. These are endothelial cells, and they are actually very, very tight together in the brain. And that's not the case in a lot of tissues in the body. There are ways in which, places in the body where these are not as tight, the endothelial cells. And then you get pericytes that are cells that sit right around the blood vessels as well. And then there is one more layer of astrocytes. So 3 layers of cells that tries to kind of, again, contain the blood vessels and make sure that anything that comes through is very highly regulated. In addition to that, you see these little kind of dots, and I'm not sure if that's visible on my slide, but these little kind of green dots also on there, they're actually small little pumps that are existing there so that if something kind of gets through, they actually pump it right back into the blood. So again, trying to absolutely regulate what's allowed to get into the brain or not. So this kind of multiple physical and biological and chemical barriers are all in place to protect your brain the most possible. So it's not unreasonable to say, well, wait a second, some of these drugs don't get into the brain. But you've heard from Dr. Davis that we've already shown that some of these drugs work, even if they're not designed to get into the brain, because in the presence of a brain metastasis, we already know that some of these structures are disrupted, and we know that we actually can see the tumor on a brain MRI because it is disrupted. So these drugs work. You've seen the BRAF inhibitors. They have a high rate of efficacy in terms of shrinkage of tumor, not as much of a duration of response as we would like. You've heard about immunotherapy giving us, up to 50% responses, and those responses are highly durable, which kind of what you see on the right side here is the fact that patients do well at even 3 years, more than 50% of control of disease in all of those patients. And then you've also heard that patients with symptomatic disease have a little harder to manage, but once you induce a response, you can get long-term responses. So this is not just in melanoma. Unfortunately, one of the things that we mentioned is the fact that the paradigm currently is to first prove that something works outside the brain and then bring it to the brain and prove that it works. But, that's not the way we like things to be, but at least that's one way to get more drugs approved in this space. We know that in lung cancer, immunotherapy and targeted therapy have activity in the brain. We've seen some really incredible developments recently in breast cancer with the tucatinib, a drug that is designed to get into the brain, and with these antibody drug conjugates that are not designed to get into the brain, and yes, they get really good activity intracranially, again, BRAF and MEK inhibitors. So the idea here is more and more therapies that are administered systemically, either as pills or intravenous, are showing that they can help the brain. And so with that in mind, our questions and kind of the things that we started to think about is how to improve the access of patients to high-level care, multidisciplinary care. How do we choose to use radiation versus systemic therapy or versus surgery, or what sequence or combination? And very importantly, I mean, you've heard summarized in the last couple of hours so much knowledge about brain metastases, but also that's pretty much all we know, meaning that there's still a lot of knowledge we don't, and there's a lot of things we still don't know. So we want to learn from every patient with brain metastases. We want to collect their clinical data, probably also their biospecimen. You heard about the blood, the tissue, and heard about the stools as well and how important those are. And we really care about patient-reported outcomes. We want to hear directly from the patient how they're experiencing their symptoms, how they're experiencing their side effects from treatment. And we want to develop trials to answer questions that are specific for patients with brain metastases. And as we pull all of that together, really develop new drugs that are designed for this, drugs that are designed specifically to help patients with brain metastases. So we've been thinking about this for a very long time. And MD Anderson, I do have to, kind of recognize the institution for starting to think about this a very long time ago and to try to organize around it. So back in 2015, actually, we had a steering committee that's, kind of a brain metastases steering committee thinking about ways we can get there. And in 2016, the committee recommended establishing a world-class interdisciplinary brain metastases clinic so that we could really enable novel clinical research and we establish new standards of care for patients with brain metastases. And what that looks like is I showed you how our multiple disciplines are all, have ways to work together. However, the patient ends up being kind of shuttled among buildings, days, and different services. And now what we do in our brain metastases clinic is we actually bring the patient to one location and we bring all of the specialists to the patient. So we actually see the patients as a team. So the neurosurgeon, the medical oncologist, and the radiation oncologist see the patient together in the brain metastases clinic in one visit. So this way, we know that this is a population where decision-making has to be made very, very quickly, and we don't have time to lose. And the fact that all of our clinicians are together, coming up with a plan and communicating it directly to the patient, can quickly improve patient care. So we proposed this in 2016, and it took a couple of years to get approved for funding and for starting the clinic. And we managed to open it in January 2019. So these are the first days of the brain metastases clinic, where you see in this picture we have our radiation oncologist, Dr. Lee. You heard from Dr. Glitza earlier today. Dr. Weinberg is one of our neurosurgeons. We have fellows, and we have a radiologist, a neuroradiologist that was with us, and again, started seeing patients all together at the same time, trying to get the care to directly to them. And since then, I am very pleased to tell you that with the leadership of, co-leadership of Dr. Fred Lang, the chair of neurosurgery, Dr. Jing Li, the CNS section chief for radiation oncology, and then, we have 5 neurosurgeons, we have 5 or 6 radiation oncologists, 8 medical oncologists from multiple disciplines, including breast cancer, renal cell, phase 1, you've seen from our melanoma team. We also have dedicated neuroradiology, and we have seen over 1,000 patients. We saw patient number 1,000 about 3 weeks ago. And we see those patients 3 days a week. We develop clinical trials for them. You see that we've increased enrollment here. About 10% of those patients have been going on clinical trials. And we're actually becoming bold enough to propose clinical trials specifically for multiple cancers at the same time, because some of the stuff is expected to work in more than one cancer. And as we do this, we really recognize that bringing patient care together is at the center of everything we do. And from that, we're going to be able to learn from those patients. So trying to get clinical data, again, biospecimen, you heard about that. And then we can enroll those patients on clinical trials. But we also recognize the fact that to develop new drugs, we really have to think about how to use them and kind of try to develop models that we can test so many different combinations in mice before we actually consider bringing them to patients. So this way we'll be able to develop the best possible combination. And I do want to recognize the incredibly generous donation from the McDougall family that helped us establish the Andrew M. McDougall Brain Metastases Clinic and Research Program. So with the co-leadership of Dr. Lang and Dr. Lee, we have the opportunity, as you see on the right, we have the clinic itself, and that's part of our clinical operations in the institution. But on the left, and under the leadership of Stride with Liz Burton and Andy Futriol, we're building a research program. So that research program encompasses the clinical trials that we're doing now and then will help us do in the future, but also will help us, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, about how to do the preclinical research to graduate combinations so that they can be used in clinical trials. And we really also want to understand the biology and the basic science and really understand why these things happen in the brain, maybe discover new ways to treat patients with brain metastases, and again, maybe even new pathways that we hadn't known that existed already. So in that context, I'm going to share with you just one slide. This is a lot of science, but I'm not going to go into the details of it. I just want to show you how we're designing these models. As you see below, these mice are actually designed so that they can have brain metastases. Most of the work you see in mouse models actually is in mice that don't have any problem with their brain. So the brain is intact, and most of the time, the tumor is injected in their flanks, and then they're given treatments, and then you see if they survive, you see if the tumor shrinks. These are mouse models in collaboration with the Traction team at MD Anderson and Tim Heffernan, where they actually have established brain metastases. So when we actually ask the question, does this drug work? We can ask, does it work in the brain of these mice? The other unique situation here is most of the mice, like some of the stuff you've heard from Dr. McQuaid, are actually immune deficient. They're designed so that they don't reject the tumor, so that you can try different drugs. these are actually mice that are immune competent, that they have an immune system, and you can ask the question, does immunotherapy work or not in those mice? And so we can really use this approach to try multiple different ways to treat these cancers and multiple different drugs, and again, choose which combination or which specific drugs actually look like they have the best outcome, so that when we go to propose a clinical trial or to run a clinical trial, we have a very clear idea of what we're trying to achieve. So it's a very important aspect of the research program that we're doing. So just to kind of wrap it up, I think importantly, I hope you heard that multidisciplinary care is the absolute best way to treat patients with brain metastases. We really have to get all of these disciplines on together to choose the best treatment to start with, and again, how to combine these treatments and how to sequence them. We have a lot of work to do to show that approved therapy may actually work in the brain or may not. You know, you heard earlier today a question from the audience about the Opdualag or nivolumab. You know, it's already FDA approved for melanoma, but you know, despite the fact that I led that phase 3 trial, we couldn't convince pharma at the time to include brain metastases in that study, but now we're going to be able to ask the question, after it's approved, does it work in the brain or not? You've heard about the role of, say, OXPHOS or other pathways that are interesting, that are being discovered to be unique to the brain. We want to discover new drugs for those and actually design those drugs to get into the brain. We want to learn from every patient we see, because we, from the specific journey and experience of every patient, we know we'll be able to learn how to potentially identify ways to make patients better and maybe in the future even prevent brain metastases. And that is a lofty goal, but maybe feasible. And lastly, I will say that we really need to disseminate this knowledge. I don't want patients to have to come to MD Anderson to get the best brain metastases care. You come here, we're going to take care of you, but I want people in their local community to be able to be treated in the best way possible. So our job and our mandate is to try to disseminate this knowledge to practicing oncologists as well. And then finally, I will say, we have a lot of work to do, but we have a team, and I have to say also work across the nation with other colleagues that are also dedicated to do this, that we really need to make brain metastases more effective and hopefully more accessible. So thank you so much for listening. This is the end of my talk. I will stop sharing here, and